We've seen the definition of schema and different types of social schemas. We'll take a look at the types of things that schemas influence. They influence a lot of things related to our perceptions and related to processing of information. Schemas influence what we pay attention to. We're more likely to pay attention to things that fit into our expectations or our schemas. They influence how we interpret information. And we've seen that with the configural model of impression formation. We form a first impression of an individual, and then we interpret further information that we receive about that individual in line with the schema. They influence what we remember, what we recall, and they influence how we behave. Let's first take a look at how they influence memory. Do you recall the story that I read to you at the beginning of the first video on schemas? This was a story about two young men who were by a river and a canoe came by. So this was a story that comes from indigenous people from the U.S. Pacific Northwest. It's a Native American story. And it was used by a researcher named Bartlett, who did an experiment and studied this and then published the results in his 1932 book called Remembering. So this story, the War of the Ghosts story, is something that he gave to some well-educated British citizens, had them read the story, and then asked them at various points later to recall the story, to write down the story. They got the basic plot correct, but they tended to get confused about some of the details. For example, the story was about these two men who went to hunt seals, but often when recalling the story, these British individuals would talk about it as fishing. When the story talks about something black coming out of the young man's mouth, that gets turned into frothing or vomiting in the stories that the British participants recalled. And the story specifically mentions canoes, but that would often get turned into boats. So these types of differences are based on cultural differences. And this result has been used to demonstrate is that people's cultures influence their schemas and their expectations. And because these British participants didn't have the same kinds of schemas for the activities of ghosts and war and warriors and death that would fit with the story elements of the War of the Ghosts story, they imposed their schemas that fit with their culture onto these things. So ghosts ended up for a lot of the participants being imagined and not being actual ghosts. So our cultural expectations and the stories that we hear in our culture, but also our experiences, have an impact on how we interpret information, how we then recall information later. Another study that examined the effects of schemas on memory was an experiment. So I'll ask you this: what's your schema for a librarian? This would be an achieved role. When you think about a librarian, what kinds of characteristics come to mind? Well, you might think of an image like this, which could be considered a prototypical librarian, a woman wearing glasses, maybe middle-aged or older, and of course, standing in a library and dealing with books. In comparison to that, what's your schema for the role of waitress? And these days we'd be more likely to call them servers, but the study I'm going to talk about was from 1982, so waitress was still a pretty common term to use. What's your schema for a waitress? Well, it could be a number of things, but you might think of someone who's younger, definitely not the same kinds of characteristics as you might think of for a librarian, although you probably think about a woman. So using these two schemas, Cohen developed a study that examined how people's schemas about these different roles might have an impact on their memory for events. So participants in this study watched a videotape. So this is back in the 1980s, and we didn't have just video clips that you could watch, so they had to put an actual VHS tape in. So they watched a videotape, and it was a videotape that was a woman and a man, and they were eating dinner, and supposedly the woman was celebrating her birthday and having a birthday dinner at home with her husband. And she talked about a number of different things in this video. They were eating, and she talked about, she was wearing glasses, and she was talking about how she played the piano. She was drinking beer. They also talked about watching TV and a number of other things. And the participants were told just to watch this videotape and that they'd be asked some questions about it later. The independent variable in this study was what the participants were told about the woman in the video. Some participants were told that she was a waitress, that was her occupation. Other participants were told before they watched the video, that she was a librarian. So they were randomly assigned to believe that, or randomly assigned to be told that her occupation was that of a waitress or that of a librarian. And then they watched this videotape. Then they were asked to remember certain things about the video. And what Cohen found was that participants had better memory. They had 88% accuracy for schema consistent information. So participants who were told that she was a waitress were more likely to remember that she was drinking beer. Participants who were told that she was a librarian were more likely to remember that she had mentioned classical music and that she was wearing glasses. Whereas those who'd been told that she was a waitress had poorer memory for things like the fact that she was wearing glasses. The participants who were told that she was a librarian had misremembered what she was drinking. They thought she was drinking wine instead. So schemas, our expectations, our cognitive structures, influence not only what we pay attention to and what we will encode in memory, but also what we might recall about memory. So what happens when people encounter schema inconsistent information? When you see a waitress who talks about classical music or a librarian who drinks beer, if that's inconsistent with your schema. What happens when people encounter that? Do they ignore it? Do they forget it? Do they pay attention to it because it stands out? Well, it depends on a number of different factors. The determinants of memory for schema inconsistent information depends on the strength of the schema, first of all. So if a schema is pretty new, say it's a person schema, you've just met this individual and you have very little information about them, it's not solidified, it's not well established, then if you develop an overall first impression and you get information that's inconsistent with that, you see examples of behavior, you get other information that's inconsistent with the schema you've formed initially, then it's likely you'll change your schema. However, if it's a schema that is well established, if it's a long-standing stereotype, or if you've had a well-developed schema about an individual, then that inconsistent information is going to make less of a difference. You're going to be more likely to ignore it or possibly discount it. Another determinant of whether people will remember schema inconsistent information is their motivation. When we're motivated to be accurate about an individual, then we will be more likely to remember schema inconsistent information. If we're not particularly motivated to be accurate, if it doesn't really matter if we have an accurate schema about an individual or about a group, then we're not going to be as likely to notice or to remember schema inconsistent information. And then part of it depends on attentional resources. If you're an observer who is distracted by something else, you're not even going to notice the schema inconsistent information. You're not going to notice that somebody's behavior doesn't fit with a stereotype, or that their behavior doesn't fit with the initial impression that you had of them. So if you're not able to pay attention to schema inconsistent information, you're not going to be able to remember it. So schemas influence what we pay attention to, how we interpret information, what we remember. One of the most interesting things about how schemas can influence our social interactions is that schemas influence how we behave toward people. Our expectations will influence how we act towards someone. So if you're encountering an older adult, you might speak slowly and loudly to them because you have an assumption or schema of older adults that maybe they don't hear well or they don't process information well. So your behavior is influenced by the social schemas that you have. And that produces some really interesting effects. Our schemas about others can influence our behavior toward others. So there's a really interesting study that examined this. This was conducted in the 1970s by Snyder and her colleagues. And they had men participate. These were male college students. They made the assumption that they were heterosexual, and they didn't actually ask them about their sexual orientation, but they made the assumption that they were heterosexual. And they told them they were going to be interacting with another person over the phone. So they had each come in individually. They sat in a little lab space. They had a phone, and then they were given a picture and told, this is the woman you'll be interacting with. The picture wasn't actually of the woman that they were interacting with. It was pictures that had been predetermined to be either physically attractive or unattractive. So in a previous set of studies, they'd already determined, they gave them pictures to rate, and they had chosen which ones were the most attractive, which ones were the least attractive. And so participants in this study received a picture of a woman who had been seen as attractive, or one that had been previously rated as unattractive. And they were told, this is the woman you're interacting with. In actuality, they were interacting with another participant, a female participant, and it was not the person in the picture. The female participant did not know that the male participant had received this picture, so they didn't really know anything about it. Then the pair was given a topic to talk about, and they recorded their phone conversation. And then later on, they had other researchers who were unaware of the condition that people were randomly assigned to listen to those interactions, listen to the recordings of the interactions, and then rate those interactions. They rated the men on how warm and friendly they were. They also rated the women on how warm and friendly they were. So the dependent variable, the outcome, was the warmth of the conversation. Not surprisingly, men who thought they were interacting with an attractive woman, those who had received the attractive picture, were warmer in their behaviors than were men who had received the unattractive photo, the photo of the unattractive woman. And again, this was not actually a photo of the woman they were talking to. So the interesting thing about this is that when these other researchers were listening to the conversations, they judged the women who were talking to the men who had the attractive picture as warmer than the women who were talking to the men who had the unattractive picture. And again, the women, these observers who were making the ratings, had no idea who was talking to who or what the study was about. The women who were in the study, the participants, didn't know what was happening either. So the men somehow were bringing out different behaviors in the women they were talking to. And this is kind of how it's been explained. So you have the schema activated. This is a participant this is an attractive picture, and the schema is activated. She looks nice and very attractive. There's a well-known positive stereotype of people who are physically attractive. That leads to behavior in accordance with that schema. So he gets the schema of attractive people activated. They're nice, they're friendly, they're socially adept, and that leads to warm behavior. So the behavior fits with the schema, and then that behavior produces a response in this individual's partner. Thanks. It's going to be fun talking to you. And I like how they have her hair look a little messy and they give her glasses, kind of indicating that she's not really attractive. But her behavior, her warm behavior, then confirms this initial schema. Oh, you know what? She is really nice. And that's what's known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is one of the things that people get kind of confused about. We have a perceiver in the Snyder and colleagues study. It's the man. And they have an expectation about the target. The target person in this case is the woman. And then the perceiver behaves consistently with those expectations. So if the perceiver thinks, oh, this is going to be a good interaction, then they're going to be friendly. If the perceiver thinks, this person doesn't look very interesting, then they're not going to be as friendly. So they behave in a way that's consistent with what their expectations or their schemas are. And then the target person reacts to that perceiver's behavior. If somebody is warm and friendly to you, it's likely that you're going to be warm and friendly back to them. If someone is colder toward you, it's likely that you're going to be colder in response to them. So the perceiver ends up fulfilling his or her own prophecy, their schema, about the target. I think this interaction is going to go really well. Oh, as it turns out, it did go really well, and it's because their own behavior influences the target person's behavior. And this is also known as behavioral confirmation. And the target doesn't have to know anything about this. So the women in the study did not know that their partners had received a picture, that it was an attractive picture, an unattractive picture. They were just responding to this guy who was talking to them on the phone. The guy who was talking to them on the phone was engaging in behaviors based on their schema, based on their stereotype or their expectation about the individual. So just giving another example here. Say we have this woman who has a schema of boys with messy black hair who eat cereal and they're a loser. This person who's eating cereal here has no idea that she has this schema activated, but it's likely that her behavior toward him will reflect her schema. She might ignore him. She might be rude to him. She might roll her eyes at him. And meanwhile, he's just thinking about his cereal. He doesn't realize that she has this schema. She's not saying it directly to him. She's not saying, you're a loser. But it's likely that her behaviors will reflect that. She might be colder toward him. She might not treat him very kindly. And then he might ignore her. And then she might think, see, I told you he was a loser. So the target they don't have to be told about the expectations at all. They're just responding to the behaviors. So we're going to be looking a lot at how schemas influence behaviors in a lot of different ways. We'll continue to look at it throughout the course. And the next thing that we'll look at with respect to schemas will be how culture influences schemas, and then some more about role schemas. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.